When people think about Merdeka, they typically think about a triumphant Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, who was a wonderful man, by the way, chanting Merdeka, Merdeka, Merdeka at the Stadium Negara, the national stadium, right? But a question that people never seem to ask is, why did the British decide to give up their jewel in the crown of Southeast Asia? Why would they give up a resource-rich region full of tin, mines, copper, rubber, and so on and so forth? Why would they give all these things up? Do you think the British simply gave these things up willingly? Or did they have to be forced by the barrel of a gun? Well, the obvious answer is that privileges are never given up willingly. Ruling classes never simply give up their privileges, and they have to be forced in order to surrender them, right? So, while we can no doubt give great thanks to Tunku Abdul Rahman for his delegation visits to Great Britain in order to ensure our independence, there is another man whose name draws the ire of many a Malaysian, another man who is indeed a polarizing figure in Malaysia for his mixed legacy, right? This man is none other than Chin Peng, the Communist Party leader of Malaysia. Now, by no means is this video meant to denigrate Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was by all accounts a wonderful man, a brilliant statesman, and an excellent leader. A man of justice and humanity who fostered tolerance, kindness, and racial harmony in Malaysians. At least for myself, I can say that I am glad that we had Tunku Abdul Rahman as our first Prime Minister, right? So I'm very, very glad to have had Tunku Abdul Rahman. But at the same time, there is a certain inconvenient truth that is not told in history class. There is a certain inconvenient truth that is kept hidden from the Malaysian masses. A story that has yet to be told to the people on how Merdeka, how independence could be made possible, right? And today I hope to tell you this story. The story of this man named Chin Peng. Well, it wasn't really his name. His name was actually Ong Bun Hua. But Chin Peng was basically the communist leader of Malaya who has a mixed reputation. A very, very mixed reputation and a very, very complicated legacy, in the minds of many Malaysians. Because although the collateral damage of his movement, I must first of all say straightforwardly, the collateral damage was tremendous, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people. This is not my words. These are not my words. But even by Tunku's admission, Merdeka, independence could not have been possible without the valiant struggle of this man against the British. It was this man who forced the British to the negotiating table with the Tunku, and it was this man who basically forced the British to stop colonizing Malaya, right? It was Tunku who entered the negotiations with them and ultimately got independence for us. But it was this man who got the British to the negotiating table in the first place, right? Now, this video is no substitute to Chin Peng's book, of course. You really, really need to read it to get a full picture of his life. Today, I won't be doing a very long video because I just want to give you a brief overview of who this man was and what his contributions were towards the achievement of Merdeka, despite the bloody struggle that caused an immense amount of bloodshed, right? with hate and violence on both sides, both the British and the communist side, right? But today I will just be giving you a rundown as to who this Chin Peng was, okay? And why he was instrumental in basically driving the British out of Malaya. So, let's begin. It doesn't really seem to make sense that the British would so kindly pack up and go home in 1957, right? From a capitalist standpoint, at least, it doesn't seem to make sense that the British would just say, all right, guys, you know what? You guys deserve independence because you're so self-sufficient and so able to govern yourselves that, you know, we don't need to do the white man burden thing in your country anymore, and you guys can be a country of your own. The thing is, though, that the British never wanted to stop colonizing Malaya, right? They didn't mind giving up Hong Kong because Hong Kong, for one, is not rich in natural resources, first of all. And second of all, Hong Kong was seen as a backwater dump where they basically used as a smuggling entrepot to smuggle opium into China, right? But Malaya was the jewel of the crown in Southeast Asia. Malaya is rich in natural resources. It is not poor. It is rich in rubber, it is rich in tin, it is rich in timber, it is rich in copper. It is rich in pretty much everything, or rather anything that the British capitalists could possibly want to meet the demands of the Industrial Revolution, right? The British never wanted to give up Malaya. They had to give it up kicking and screaming, right? And it was Chin Peng, basically Chin Peng, the man who made it the most painful for the British to keep staying on in Southeast Asia, right? So, without further ado, I'm just going to explain who this Chin Peng was. So Chin Peng was born Ong Bun Hua in the northern state of Perak in the small town of Sitiawan to the Chinese migrant parents who had come from Fujian province in the early 1900s. Now, Chin Peng was one of 11 children the couple had in total. And Chin Peng's father was, well, he was a Chinese Malaysian small businessman who traded in spare parts for tires, in tire parts. And Chin Peng's mother was a housewife. Despite their business being hit hard by the financial crisis of the Great Depression of the 1930s, Bun Hua's parents never shirked in their responsibility to educate their children, and he was sent to a Chinese medium school for his formative years. And his parents, despite struggling financially in order to keep the family afloat, still made sure to educate their children by buying them a variety of academic literature, including many Chinese historical stories like Romance of the Three Kingdoms or The Water Margin, which young Bun Hua read with relish, right? And it was from these tales that Bun Hua developed a sense of immense idealism, reading about stories of heroes fighting against evil forces, of good triumphing over evil, and of the unjust being deposed by the just. And it is these stories that first form the roots of socialism in Bun Hua's head, before Bun Hua even knew what the word socialism was, right? And then, in his secondary years, that was the beginning of the Second World War, right? And it was in this time when ferocious attacks by Japan on China were basically rallying the Chinese in Malaya against Japan with a sense of immense nationalism, because at that time there was no Malaysia yet. and the Chinese in this place still considered themselves citizens of China, who would go back after things had settled down, right? And that's why these schools like Zhonghua and Quancheng, these Chinese vernacular schools, were set up in order to prepare the diaspora for their return from their exodus back to China, right, in the future. But I'm just digressing a bit. So Chin Peng developed an immense degree of nationalism in his secondary school years, and he read texts from various socialist authors, including Mao Zedong, who would be the foremost influence in his life, right? So, although Chin Peng initially started out as a Kuomintang supporter, he very soon realized that the Kuomintang's methods were basically losing strategies, and he realized that Mao Zedong was far more pragmatic and basically grounded in reality, as opposed to the Kuomintang, who basically relied too much on Western support, as opposed to Mao Zedong, who preached self-sufficiency and rebellion against colonial powers, not just Japan. So very soon, Chin Peng, or I should say Ong Bun-hwa, found himself calling himself a communist, right? And he officially converted, if you will, to communism at the age of 15, right? At the tender age of 15, he had converted to communism, and by the time he was 16, he was already organizing in secret communist societies, which were really an annoyance to the British colonial authorities, because, you know, the communists were the biggest thorn in the British side before the Japanese, right? So Chin Peng basically had to use an alias, Chin Peng, instead of his name Bun Hua. And the British colonial authorities kept a tight watch on the people to ensure that none of them were influenced by this so-called poisonous foreign ideology of communism. And so, you know, left-wing publications were basically stifled in both Malaya and Singapore, and left-wing activists, well, they had to go underground in order to avoid being detected by the Brits. This is only a brief biography of Chin Peng's life, so you really have to read his book if you want the whole picture of his life. I'm not going to tell you 500 pages of his life, right? So we'll skip on to the outbreak of the Second World War, right? Now, in the outbreak of the Second World War, basically, the communists basically went into the jungle in order to fight against the Japanese, right? Not only that, many Malaysian Chinese, or I should say Malayan Chinese back then, who were being hounded and persecuted by the Japanese, also joined up with the communists. Because, you know, just like the Jews in Germany joined up with the resistance movements against the Nazis, the Chinese Malayans also joined up with the communists, not necessarily because they had any belief in communist ideology, but because they were the forefront of the resistance against Japan, right? And so, you know, they joined up with the communists, and basically, you know, they formed what you call the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, which was a majority Chinese group. But also, there were some Malays and some Indians, as well as some people from minority races, right? Now, the British were no friends of communists or communism, right? Because it was against their actions in Malaya, right? I mean, you know, they and the communists obviously had mutually contradictory interests, shall we say. So the British were not fans of communists, and they went all out to demonize them, right? You know, even by portraying them as being, you know, the Chinese who secretly wanted to take over the country, right? But ironically, at that moment, the British as well as the communists realized that they had a common enemy, the rising sun of Japan. And so the British and the communists decided, well, you know what, the enemy of my enemy is still my friend, right? So they decided to work together. And it was Chin Peng, 19-year-old Chin Peng, who was basically the secretary of the Communist Party, Lai Tek's right-hand man. And we'll get into Lai Tek later on, because Lai Tek proves to be a British mole later on. But it was Chin Peng who was basically responsible for coordinating the collaboration between the Brits and the communists, right? Chin Peng is basically the middleman in all of this. Yeah, most of us haven't even entered university by 19. Pardon me. I mean, many of us have, but some of us haven't even entered university by 19 in this day and age. But Chin Peng grew up fast. By 19, he was already coordinating the communists and the Brits, right? So it was Chin Peng's job to basically ensure smooth coordination between the Brits, Force 136, which was largely comprised of Kuomintang supporters, you know, including Lim Boon Eng, the Singaporean nationalist hero Lim Boon Eng, Lim Bo Seng, sorry, and also and the British and the communists. So it was Chin Peng's job to ensure smooth collaboration between all these groups, right? And, well, naturally, with the combined strength of the communists and the British, the Japanese were defeated, and at the end of the war, Chin Peng even received an OBE, an Order of the British Empire, which is basically a Medal of Honor they give you for exemplary service to the crown. As Chin Peng explains, you know, when we were, you know, when we killed British people, oh, sorry, pardon me, when we killed people in Britain's interests, we were not treated as bandits or terrorists. We were given medals and treated like heroes. Thus, you only became a terrorist if you killed against Britain's interests, right? So, basically, at that point is when their relationship began to sour. Because the British, basically, in setting free many communists who had been in prison before that, in order to join the communist ranks, were then planning to put those communists back into prison. And the British basically did not want the communists to stay as a legitimate party, right? They wanted to come back to Malaya after the war to continue being the masters and bullies, according to Chin Peng, right? So that was not acceptable to the communists, because the communists, after the Japanese left, wanted the British out of Malaya, right? Because they wanted to establish a republic of communism under Marxist-Leninist ideals, right? I cannot say for sure how that would have gone, because, you know, we don't know how that would have turned out, but the British would have none of it. And so that was when their relations began to sour, and the British started labeling the communists as communist terrorists, CTs, right? And thus there began a mass deportation campaign against anyone, namely Chinese, who was suspected of having communist sympathies, right? And so the communists went back into the jungle and, well, they became enemies again with the British, right? Now, the power struggle between the communists and the British colonial authorities is known as the Malayan Emergency, right? And Western historians will tell you that the emergency started in 1948 when communist gunmen stormed the plantation and shot dead 3 British plantation owners, right? Now, in actual fact, tensions had already been simmering before 1948. It's just that the killing of those British capitalists was what basically the straw that broke the camel's back, which actually led to the actual outbreak of the emergency. But ever since 1945, when the British took back the reins of power, tensions had already been simmering in Malaya. You know, the British, when they came back, what they did was they declared the Japanese banknotes to be valueless. And that's why Japanese banknotes are known as banana currency, because they had no value under British rule, right? And overnight, thousands of Malayans were thrust into dire poverty, and there were riots on the street. There was mass civil unrest. Crime became rampant, and instead of addressing the material conditions and frustration of the people as a result of their irresponsible policy, what did the British do? Well, they simply cracked down on these responses by the masses with draconian measures, right? When workers would hold strikes, the British would hire gangsters to go and break up those strikes, right? And when the communists would kill those gangsters, well, the British would use that as an excuse to say, see, you see, those communists are killing their own people. How cruel they must be, right? So basically, it reached boiling point. The workers' anger and frustration reached boiling point in 1948 when workers who could take it no more went to appeal to the communists to please do something about our bosses. And the communists did indeed do something about their bosses, right? So yeah, that's basically the story of how the emergency came to be, right? It wasn't simply because the communists were upset that the British didn't want to give them power. There are also material conditions of the people which led to strict draconian measures in order to stifle the people when they expressed their frustration, right? And even worse, at peaceful protests, the British, it should be known, have had indeed used extreme force, even violence, right? Even firing at unarmed protesters in order to stifle them. And this was condemned not only by the communists, but also by the Chinese community leaders of the time, including Tan Kah Kee, right? Who was, by the way, who was a capitalist, but he condemned the brutality of the British, right? So no, it wasn't simply started as a result of killing 3 plantation miners, right? But I suppose we need to get back to the story of Chin Peng, of how Chin Peng actually managed to become the Secretary General of the CPM. Well, it started when he and a bunch of other Communist Party members figured out that their leader, Lai Tek, a shadowy figure whom nobody knew much about, was actually a British spy. No, scratch that. He was actually a triple agent who was working for the communists, the British, and the Japanese, right? Basically the OG grifter. Lai Tek was the OG grifter, right? And Lai Tek, well, you know, after he suspected that he was going to be found out, what he did in 1947 is that he basically absconded to Thailand with $1 million in today's money worth of party funds, right? So basically what Chin Peng and his band did was they tracked Lai Tek to Thailand, and some Thai communists actually had Lai Tek liquidated. That's a very, very nice pun. If you know what happened to Lai Tek, he got strangled to death and he got thrown into the Chao Phraya River, right? Of course, Chin Peng was actually quite annoyed at this because, you know, he thought, you know, that the way they handled Lai Tek was a little bit messy because he wanted to interrogate Lai Tek before killing him, right? But oh well, at least Lai Tek was gone and Chin Peng was his right-hand man. So that's how Chin Peng ended up becoming the party leader. But no doubt the British would have used this as another propaganda tool to show just how brutal the communists were, right, in dealing with dissenters. Even though Litek was the original grifter, basically a double, triple agent who is basically no different from the likes of people like Thomas Sowell, the so-called ex-Marxist. So that's how Chin Peng got his role as the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Malaya. And if you read Chin Peng's book, it was not a one-sided affair of brutality, yeah? No doubt there were some very, very violent men in the Communist Party. Remember, these are battle-hardened men, many of whom had just come out of prison, who by this point had been, dehumanized by the enemies they were facing, by the brutality of the enemies they were facing, right? I'm not making excuses for them, but that's just the way it was, right? And basically, a thing that people hide about British colonial history in Malaya is the Batang Kali massacre, which took place in December of 1948, when British commandos from the Scots Guard stormed a village in Batang Kali. They took 24 men out of their houses and they shot them in cold blood, right? And this has been hidden by British propagandists. British propagandists have tried to cover this up, right? And when members of the family of those men, the family members of those men who went to England to get closure for their family members' deaths, right, to get an apology from Queen Elizabeth did not apologize, right? She did not acknowledge that those commandos were in the wrong. Because to the British, this was simply, a draconian, a punitive measure against the people for supporting communism. Or rather, it was a punitive security measure in order to stamp out communism in the region. But as a matter of fact, it was cold-blooded murder, because the British already knew that those 24 men they shot dead were not communists. But they still shot them anyway. Why? It was to send a signal to the communists. It was to send a warning to the communists that if you don't behave yourselves, if you don't turn yourselves in, more people will suffer, more people will die, right? In the 1950s, there comes a time when the communists still don't surrender to the Brits, they still don't give up. So what the British High Commissioner Harold Briggs does is he creates these things euphemistically known as new villages, right? What he did was basically to herd the Malaysian Chinese into so-called new villages, where they would be kept behind barbed wires and basically kept under constant surveillance so that they could not help the communists, right? It was basically a measure to starve out the communists and lower their morale, right? And basically, this is why Petaling Jaya, for example, is so full of Chinese people, because the Chinese were largely concentrated in those regions, right? So you'll find that some regions in Malaysia have got a majority of Chinese people, and you can thank the Briggs Plan for this, basically. The forceful resettlement of Chinese villagers into concentration camps in order to stifle the morale of the communists and basically cut off their food supply, because they assumed that Chinese would naturally be sympathetic towards communists, right? So by this point, Chin Peng has already become the most wanted man in the British Empire, right? He's the most painful thorn in their side, the leader of the Communist Party, and there's a $250,000 reward for his head. Well, to put things in perspective, a school teacher's salary, which was considered high-end for that time, in the 1950s would be about $150, Straits dollars of that time, right? So can you imagine how much $250,000 could buy you. You would be set for life, for 2 generations, in fact, right? So the Brits naturally really found Chin Peng to be a very painful thorn in their side, right? And basically, yeah, that's the gist of it. Why did they resort to such, punitive measures against the people of Malaya? Why did they treat the people hostage? Why did they basically use the people as basically a bargaining tool in order to get the communists to surrender themselves? Well, because they knew that the communists, most of them at least, cared about the welfare of the people, but they didn't. So they were happy to use the people as a bargaining tool so as to tell Chin Peng, look, Chin Peng, look how the people are suffering because of you. Turn yourself in and we can end their suffering. That's basically it. So in 1955, Chin Peng writes a letter to the Chief Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman, the future Prime Minister of Malaysia, asking if they can have a negotiation, if they can have some peace talks, right? And being the reasonable man he was, the Tunku agreed to the peace talks, right? So Tunku and Chin Peng meets at Baling. Chin Peng goes with his friends Rashid Maidin and Chen Tien, and Tunku goes with the Singaporean Chief Minister David Marshall and the Malaysian Chinese Association leader Tan Cheng Lock, right? And they try to negotiate a peace settlement. Now, according to the propaganda video, which I'm going to show you, it seems that the Tunku is being tough on Chin Peng.
The eyes of the world turned for a fateful 2 days on Baling near the Thai frontier for talks between government representatives and communist terrorist leaders. As the chief actors in the drama arrived, hopes ran high, not only among the Baling townsfolk but among all the people of Malaya, that by some miracle the communists would repent of the evil they had done and surrender for the good of the country. The whole town flocks to the school which has been prepared as the conference room to watch the chief ministers arrive. Tunku Abdul Rahman and Mr. David Marshall are as one in their attitude to communism, supported by Sir Cheng Lok Tan. They are prepared to give the communists a fair hearing in the hopes of a peaceful settlement. The austere conference room waits with a sense of history, while a teacher's house has been prepared to accommodate the communists. Ceremony in the arrival of the communist delegates. 2 ordinary police trucks with hard benches picked them up at the jungle edge and brought them into Baling. All necks craned for a glimpse of the #1 terrorist. There he is, that's him. Chin Peng, directly responsible for a brutal 7-year campaign of murder and terrorism against the ordinary people of Malaya. Propaganda chief Chen Chan is with him, and also Abdul Rashid bin Maidin, who escaped from the Malacca detention camp in 1951. Nearly 100 pressmen and photographers wait expectantly as the talks are about to begin. The government delegation is confident, as well they might be, led by elected chief ministers with every right to speak with authority on behalf of the Malayan people. Communists, escorted by Mr. John Davis, the famous Force 136 guerrilla leader and former colleague of Chin Peng during the Japanese occupation. However starved his rank and file may be, it's obvious that the boss has been living well in his Siamese hideout. The communists' first demand, as expected, was for recognition of the Malayan Communist Party. This was flatly refused. They then demanded complete freedom for all terrorists should they surrender, and the right to form a new political party. These demands were also turned down. The Tunku then yielded a point that surrendered terrorists could join existing political parties once they had proved their loyalty to Malaya. But further he could not go without imperiling the country's security. The crowd and pressmen waited tense while the talks went into night session. But the communists refused to accept the amnesty terms. The amnesty means surrender, they said. We will not accept surrender at any time. We will carry on the struggle to the last man. Thus proving beyond dispute that in their lust for power, they have no care or feeling for the ordinary people who long for the end of terrorism. There was no more that the Tunku could do without endangering the people he represents and the very country itself. So the communists returned to the jungle to continue their war, or to think again, certain of one thing, that they are now dealing with the people's representatives. Meanwhile, the chief ministers give the press a full account of what happened, freely answering all their questions. The Tunku declined to call the unsatisfactory outcome a breakdown. He is confident that the communists are so anxious to end the war that they will be ready for further talks when he returns from London. I will never give in, he told them, and the people of Malaya are with him.
But as a matter of fact, if you actually read Chin Peng's book, the Tunku was actually quite nice to Chin Peng. The Tunku actually told Chin Peng that he'd read his manifesto and he thought it was quite good and he agreed with his points, but he was anti-communist because it was against his religion and his ideology and it went against the so-called Malayan way of life, right? But if the communists would surrender themselves and subject themselves for re-education, well, they could assimilate into Malayan society and become productive members of society, basically. And Chin Peng said that, he wanted the communists to be a legitimate political power in Malaya. That was his condition. And he didn't want his people to be treated like criminals who had come out of the jungle like criminals. But that term was basically unacceptable for Tunku, David Marshall and Tan Cheng Lock, because the communists, according to them, had been conducting armed struggle, basically. And unlike the communists in other countries like Australia or America, they had been conducting armed struggle, and therefore they needed to subject themselves for re-education in order to become useful, productive members of Malaya, right? Now, of course, this doesn't take into account the fact that that basically the reason the communists in Malaya were conducting armed struggles because Malaya was a British colony and the British were brutalizing the locals, right? In America and Australia, the material conditions are a bit different. So the people of America don't have to conduct armed struggle because they're not being colonized, right? But anyway, Chin Peng ended up being very, very frustrated at the end of the talks. And he said, well, in that case, I would rather just continue my struggle. We would rather just struggle to the end, right? And the Tunku was actually quite courtly to Chin Peng. He was very, very gentlemanly to Chin Peng, and he asked him if there was anything else he needed before letting him go back into the jungle, as per their agreement, right? He had every chance to trap Chin Peng at that moment, right? But the Tunku was not a Talibarut. The Tunku was a man of principle, and even though his hands were tied, because he was still an administrator of the British Empire, at least we can say that the Tunku was a man of principles and honor, right? So Chin Peng goes back into the jungle. Basically, Chin Peng retreats into Thailand after the failed negotiations at Baling. But Tunku ironically said that Baling led straight to Merdeka, right? Because it was at the Baling talks where he could prove to the British that he had a tough stand on communism. So basically, the British could trust him with the country of Malaya, right? And, well, basically, you might be quite surprised, but Tunku even acknowledges that without Chin Peng's struggle against the British, we might not have Merdeka. Check this quote out. I have made my position quite clear. I am not a communist. I am an anti-communist because communism is against my religion and against my policy. Deep in my heart, I also felt that without the communist disturbances and anti-imperialist action, we might never have got our independence. I am not anti-communist in that sense. I am anti-communist because I wanted to have our democratic country to ourselves. With communist rule, there can never be any democracy. So basically, Chin Peng retreats into southern Thailand after the failed Baling talks, where he continues his armed struggle to attempt to take over the Malayan government and replace it with a socialist republic of communism, right? Funded no less by his hero, Mao Zedong, right? Prime Minister Razak actually asked Chairman Mao to please stop funding the communists, to which Mao replied, how could I not fund the communists? They are my comrades after all, but don't worry, they're not going to win, right? And Deng Xiaoping, after Mao, continues to fund the communists because he believes at first that they might have a fighting chance at winning, right? But after he forms diplomatic relations with the government of Malaysia, and after he basically forms ties with Southeast Asian leaders and wants to maintain good terms with them, that's when he changes his tune on Chin Peng. So he invites Chin Peng into his office one day in the 80s, and he says to him that, bro, we can't fund you anymore because we want to maintain good relations with the countries of Southeast Asia, right? So this is the last batch of money we're going to give you, and basically we are going to stop funding you from now on. I suggest that you use this money to set up businesses for your comrades and basically use it wisely, right? So with his rice bowl being broken, his source of funding being broken, Chin Peng is basically forced to give up the armed struggle in the 80s, right? And that's where we get to the Hat Yai Peace Accords of 1989, when basically the agreement was that Chin Peng and his comrades, who would be elderly people by that point, would be allowed to come back to Malaysia and settle, right? And many of them were. But what is extremely offensive in the minds of many, including me, is that Chin Peng was one of the few people who was not allowed to come back to Malaysia, right? The reason being that, he was a terrorist who caused great misery and hardship to the people of Malaysia. Although I'm sure that the British commandos who carried out the Batang Kali massacre would have been allowed to come back to Malaysia, right? I'm pretty sure that those British commandos would have been allowed to come back, right? So, yes, was there cruelty enacted by the communists? Of course. But was their cruelty exaggerated? Was the communist brutality in Malaya exaggerated? I have no doubt it was. As Chin Peng says, I wonder whether the passage of years has been long enough for those who lived through the emergency to glean the difference between what is historical fact and what was propagandist fiction. The following is historical fact. Throughout our emergency years, all our units were instructed to treat captured enemy forces humanely. On this issue, we followed the Mao Zedong guerrilla warfare principles on the treatment of prisoners, and our high command issued specific directives on this matter. On occasion, we actually treated enemy wounded. But in reality, we were never in a position to take on the responsibility of holding prisoners. It was difficult enough meeting our own needs. The accepted practice was to seize the weapon and release the enemy soldier. I know much has been made by British propaganda of our supposed maltreatment of prisoners. I reject these claims. On no occasion during the emergency did I ever receive a report indicating my troops had maltreated, tortured, or executed enemy personnel. As far as I know, there are no official files offering proof that they did. Certainly, I have yet to see any photographic evidence supporting such claims. On the other hand, British authorities regularly executed captured armed members of my army. This sort of action is specifically prohibited under Article 13 of the 1949 Geneva Convention covering the general protection of prisoners of war. Britain neatly sidestepped the war crimes dilemma these activities posed by maintaining, just as she did for insurance reasons, that the military action underway in Malaya was an emergency, not a war. So, in this case, I believe that our country did a great historical wrong to Chin Peng. And it's not just me who shares this view. Even Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, of all people, thought that Chin Peng should be allowed to come back, right? Mahathir, the National Socialist, thought that it was extreme not to let Chin Peng come back and visit the graves of his parents and visit his old teachers. And, so basically we've done a great historical wrong to Chin Peng, And unfortunately, this historical wrong cannot be righted, at least in any literal sense, because, well, Chin Peng has already passed away. He passed away in 2013, right? But the fact of the matter is that those racists who say that Chin Peng wanted to create a country where the Malays would be second-class citizens and where they could dominate the Malays, those racists need to really look at themselves in the mirror and really understand where their projection comes from. Because Chin Peng was a man who loved every single Malaysian. Not just the Chinese, but the Malays, the Indians, every single person in Malaysia. He loved with all his heart, right? He loved them with all his heart. And Chin Peng, in fact, advised the Malaysian Chinese to cooperate with the Malays to create a prosperous future together. Those were his words, yeah? So I'm going to end this video today with a letter by Chin Peng, basically his farewell letter, stating his hopes for the future. But yes, so again I want to say Happy Merdeka, and basically, history is never all black and white, right? And often history is written by the winners, but by reviving or by rehabilitating the memory of Chin Peng, I believe that the Malaysian government will at least show itself to be committed to righting historical wrongs and basically righting historical injustices. Thank you.